In this video, we are going to talk about the photosystems and pigments associated with photosynthesis. In another video, we talked about how plants have to be able to capture energy from the sun in order to do the reactions of photosynthesis. So that brings up the question of how do plants capture energy from the sun? And the answer to that question lies in these molecules called pigments. So let's talk a little bit more about these pigments. So pigments are molecules, and more specifically, they are a type of protein. There are three pigments, primary pigments, involved in photosynthesis in plants. The two primary pigments are chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. And a third class of pigments that are kind of accessory pigments are called carotenoids. The pigments are located in these kind of groups of molecules called photosystems. So let's talk a little bit more about a photosystem. So a photosystem is made up of several pigment molecules. A reaction center, and an electron acceptor molecule. And these photosystems and their pigments are located in the membrane of the thylakoids in the chloroplast. Let's draw a simple diagram of a chloroplast, paying attention to that thylakoid membrane to help us understand where these photosystems are located. So remember that chloroplasts are these kind of oval-shaped organelles in plant cells, and they actually have a double membrane surrounding them. Inside the chloroplast, we have these stacks of thylakoids. And then there's a fluid area called the stroma. So if we were to kind of zoom into a chloroplast and take a look at essentially just one of these thylakoids here. So we'll do kind of a little pop out here. So remember that the thylakoids and the membrane of the chloroplast are made up of these phospholipid bilayers. So these phospholipid bilayer membranes are very similar to what we looked at when we learned more about the structure of the cell membrane. So our phospholipid bilayer has these phosphate heads. and these lipid tails that kind of stick down into the middle. And just like the cell membrane, there might be other molecules that are embedded in this phospholipid bilayer, including things like proteins. And some of the proteins that are embedded in this phospholipid bilayer are going to be the proteins of the photosystems, including those pigment molecules. So here I'm just going to draw just a big yellow oval just to kind of stand for a photosystem. And in this photosystem, we have these pigment molecules, which I'm going to put in these little green dots here. And then we also have that reaction center. And then last but not least, we have that electron acceptor. So let's go back and label those. So remember that this whole kind of big oval that I drew here is going to be a photosystem. These individual little green circles are going to be the pigment molecules. The big red circle is going to be the reaction center. And this black circle up here is the electron acceptor. And to give you an idea of kind of more specifically what we're looking at, we're really only looking at part of the membrane. So up here would be the stroma. And remember, the stroma is that fluid part in the chloroplast that's outside the thylakoids. So that would make the other side of this the thylakoid lumen. Remember that lumen just refers to the space inside that thylakoid. And on another page, we're going to talk about some additional proteins that are associated with the photosystems embedded in this thylakoid membrane in order to be involved or in order to allow these reactions of photosynthesis to occur. So we might see some other transmembrane proteins. We might also see some peripheral proteins. Before we continue talking about the absorption of solar energy by pigments, we need to review something called the electromagnetic spectrum. And you have maybe heard of this in a previous science course. The electromagnetic spectrum shows you the energy that is emitted from the sun, and this energy exists in different wavelengths. And the wavelengths just indicate how close these peaks are to each other. So wavelength is just the length from one peak of a magnetic wave to the next peak. And you can see that at the one end, we have really high energy gamma rays. And so gamma rays are basically the type of radiation that can really give you radiation sickness and kill you. On the other end, we have really low energy waves, such as radio waves, which pass through you and around your house all the time without there being any negative effects. And a very small kind of area of the electromagnetic spectrum includes this visible light here. And so as humans, we are limited in what we can see. So we can't see radio waves and we can't see gamma rays or X-rays, but we can see the wavelengths of energy in this kind of narrow range of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this is where we see our colors. And so this is our visible light. These are the colors that we can see. And so you might be familiar with Roy G. Biv. And RGBIV is just a mnemonic to help you remember the colors of the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum in order. And those letters stand for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And it's actually showing you here, it's actually looking at it kind of in reverse order. And they don't have indigo kind of labeled here, but indigo would be kind of in between the blue and the violet right here. So the energy that plants absorb in order for photosynthesis to occur lay in this visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And more specifically, plants typically absorb light in the blue kind of area and the red area. So surprisingly, plants actually don't absorb a lot of light in the green area. And there's a reason why plants appear green, and that's because if we were to draw a leaf here, when sunlight hits that leaf, all of these colors are actually hitting that leaf. But in reality, the blues and the reds and the yellows are getting absorbed by the leaf, but the green wavelengths of light actually get reflected from the leaf. So they actually bounce off from the leaf and actually bounces into our eyes, which is why we see the color green. So in reality, plants are actually every color except for green. Our perception, we're only perceiving or seeing the wavelengths of light that are being reflected or bounced off of the leaf. And this is true of most colors. When we see a yellow banana, we're seeing the yellow light reflecting off of the banana. So the banana peel is absorbing all the wavelengths of visual light except for yellow. I mentioned on the previous page that plants primarily absorb light in the blues and red ends of the spectrum, and they actually reflect light that's in the green part of the spectrum. And you can kind of see that here. You can see that it's primarily happening in kind of this blue end of the spectrum and in the red, kind of orange part of the spectrum. There's a little bit of overlap into the green part, and that actually comes from the carotenoids. Here they have it labeled as beta carotene, which is one of the carotenoids. And so plants do absorb some of that green light, and they're able to do photosynthesis with some of those green wavelengths, but we still see plants as green because the majority of the energy being absorbed is actually not green or everything but green. Okay, so now that we know about pigments and photosystems and the absorption of light and electromagnetic radiation, let's talk a little bit about what happens during the light reactions of photosynthesis. So we're going to start by drawing the kind of the thylakoid membrane. And so I'm just going to draw it as a line here. But remember that this line is representing that phospholipid bilayer. So if we were to just remove a small portion just to draw it in, it would look something like this. And so this phospholipid bilayer would extend all the way around this thylakoid membrane. Now, embedded in this thylakoid membrane, we actually have two photosystems and several additional proteins that are needed for these light reactions to occur. So we'll draw those in kind of along the top here. So first let's draw the two photosystems. And to make it nice and confusing, the first one involved in the reactions is actually called photosystem 2, and the second one involved in the reactions is called photosystem 1. And the reason why they are named out of order is because the first photosystem was actually identified or discovered second, and the second was discovered first. So PS1 was discovered first, and then PS2 was discovered second. If I were the scientist that discovered them, I would have named them in a way that made more sense. So remember that associated with these photosystems, we have these pigment molecules. So these are going to be our chlorophyll and carotenoids. We also have our reaction center. And we have our electron acceptor. So these are the ones that we talked about a couple of pages ago. Associated with photosystem 2, we have three additional proteins that make up something called an electron transport chain, and then we have an enzyme called ATP synthase. So we will draw those three proteins associated with the electron transport chain, and then we will draw that ATP synthase. Associated with photosystem 1, we have two additional proteins. And the second one is an enzyme called NADP plus reductase. And then remember that the space inside this thylakoid membrane is called the thylakoid lumen. And the area outside the thylakoid is going to be the stroma. So now that we have set up the structures involved in the light reactions, let's talk a little bit more about what happens during these light reactions. So remember that we have energy from the sun that comes down and hits the plant. And remember, those pigment molecules are going to absorb the energy in the certain wavelengths of light that we talked about. So these pigment molecules absorb that energy, and they all kind of pass that energy to the reaction center. Now, the reaction center is a molecule, and it has electrons in it. So I'm going to draw a little blue electron right here. And I'm going to abbreviate this as E negative, which just stands for an electron. And so what happens is when the solar energy comes in and excites those pigments and they absorb that energy and they pass out that energy to the reaction center, what happens is that the electron gets excited. And so it actually jumps to a higher energy state. And it's going to jump to this higher energy state, and it's going to get picked up by an electron acceptor molecule. That electron acceptor molecule is then going to pass the electron through the electron transport chain. As these electrons get passed through these proteins of the electron transport chain, hydrogen ions, that were out here in the stroma, get actively transported or pumped into the lumen of the thylakoid. And in doing so, this sets up a concentration gradient for hydrogen. So we end up with a high hydrogen ion concentration in the lumen. and a lower hydrogen concentration in the stroma because the hydrogen is being actively transported into the lumen. Now, the reason why this is important is because the hydrogen ions can then move back through the structure known as ATP synthase. And in doing so, it catalyzes the reaction of ADP and phosphate combining to form ATP. Then that electron actually gets delivered to the second photosystem, which is actually called photosystem 1. While it's there, more energy from the sun hits the photosystem. And once again, those pigment molecules now in photosystem 1 direct their energy to that reaction center. So these pigment molecules absorb that solar radiation, absorb that energy, and direct the energy to that reaction center. And once again, this reaction center has an electron that it just got from the electron transport chain associated with the first photosystem, which we actually call photosystem 2. When this happens, that electron once again gets excited and gets passed to that electron acceptor. From the electron acceptor, that electron then gets passed through these additional proteins embedded in the thylakoid membrane. Now remember that the last protein in the thylakoid membrane is NADP plus reductase. And this is an enzyme that is going to catalyze the reaction that forms NADPH. And so what happens is that the electron gets incorporated. So NADP plus actually picks up that electron and some hydrogen ions in order to form NADPH. So through these reactions, it's important to note the production of ATP and NADPH because these are molecules that we are going to need during the Calvin cycle, which is the second set of reactions that occur in photosynthesis. One other thing that I need to mention is where these electrons originally come from, because you'll notice that we're constantly losing electrons to NADPH, because remember, NADP plus picks up an electron and a hydrogen ion. And so where do those electrons come from if they are constantly being transported away from these photosystems? And the answer to that question is that the electrons come from water. So back at photosystem 2, at the beginning of this process, a molecule of water actually gets split or broken. And in doing so, it gets broken into some hydrogen ions, electrons, and oxygen. And those hydrogen ions ultimately help to contribute to the hydrogen ion concentration that helps with the making of ATP synthase. The electron gets converted or transferred to the photosystem to then go through the electron transport chain and then get passed to photosystem 1, where it ultimately ends up getting combined with NADP plus to form NADPH. The oxygen will ultimately combine with another atom of oxygen to make a molecule of oxygen gas, which will then be released from the plant. And that's what we inhale as humans in order to survive. I also want to point out some things about the names of the enzymes involved in this process. So first of all, if we look at the name of ATP synthase, first of all, remember that ASE tells us that it's an enzyme. And we see that in the NADP plus reductase as well. So the ASE tells us that it's an enzyme. Now, the first part of the enzyme name tells us what it does. So to synthesize something means to make. And so ATP synthase is an enzyme that makes ATP. For NADP plus reductase, what we have is an enzyme that reduces NADP plus. And remember that reduction is an increase in electrons.